Assalamu alaikum ji. I'm your instructor, Humair Hashmi, and we are doing History and Systems of Psychology. And in that context, we had done 37 lectures so far. We are in the 38th lecture today. We have practically come up to the end of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century. In the last lecture, we had been talking about a few psychotherapists. In fact, in the last few lectures, we had talked about psychotherapists, their methodologies, and we had given you a detail of those methodologies. इससे पहले कि हम आज का नया मवाद देखें कि क्या है, let us review what we had talked about in the last lecture, that is lecture number 37. Can you recall what we talked about? We talked about two very prominent humanistic psychologists. Do you remember who are humanistic psychologists? Psychologists who are looking at, who focus at the human side of psychology, our values, our wishes, our desires, our despairs, our aspirations, हमारी ख्वाहिशात क्या हैं? Whether a person is an optimist or a pessimist, what is joy, what is happiness, all of these are the subject matter of humanistic psychologists. In that context, we had talked about two prominent American humanistic psychologists. We had also talked about their theories. We talked about one. Can you recall his name? That's right, Abraham Maslow, who gave us the theory of, can you recall that theory? The theory of hierarchy of needs, or his theory of motivations. कि इंसान के मुहर्रकात क्या हैं, इंसान की ज़रूरियात क्या हैं. एक तो उसका नुक्ता नज़र ये था, और आपको याद होगा कि इब्राहिम मास्लो ने पांच नीड्स के बारे में ज़िक्र किया था. सबसे पहली नीड जो कि हमारी बुनियादी ज़रूरत है, which he called what? The physiological needs, giving rise to the need for security or safety. If those two are satisfied, then the need for love is a pressing need, is a motivator. Once though that third one is satisfied, then the esteem need becomes more pressing. Then we want to be appreciated, we want to be looked up to, honored, held in esteem. And finally, if all of these four needs are satisfied, then he talked about the satisfaction of the need for self-actualization. Self-actualization वो है कि जो आपके एक शख्स के शख्सियत का तख्लीकी अंसर है, उसका इजहार is what he calls self-actualization. ये उसकी हायरार्की थी कि आप बुनियादी ज़रूरियात से तख्लीकी ज़रूरियात की तरफ जाएं तो आपको इंसान के मुहर्रकात दिखाई देते हैं. यही वो मुहर्रकात हैं जो इंसान को आगे बढ़ने में और आगे चलने में बनाते हैं, मजबूर करते हैं. इब्राहिम मास्लो ने एक और भी जिक्र किया था, और उसने 3 एक्सपीरियंसेस का जिक्र किया था जो हमने आपको बताए थे. वो उनमें से पहला called Plateau experience. Plateau experience is a heightened form of experience. Another was peak experience, a highly charged experience of either sorrow, despair, or happiness or joy. and then the experience of self-actualization, वो एहसास जो एक शख्स को अपनी ईजाद को मुकम्मल करने में महसूस होता है, उस एक्सपीरियंस को मास्लो सेल्फ एक्चुअलाइजेशन कहता है. और क्योंकि मास्लो because he is talking about these experiences, because he is talking about these needs which propel us, because he focuses on the positive side of human psyche, that is one reason why Abraham Maslow, the American psychologist, is included in the category of humanistic psychologist. The other person that we talked about in context of humanistic psychology was, recall, that's right, Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers was not only a psychologist, but he also developed a method of psychotherapy. Carl Rogers defines a psychologically healthy person as somebody who's open to experience, do you remember? Who fully lives in a given moment, whether of joy or sorrow, who has a sense of freedom, and who is highly creative. कार्ल रॉजर्स के ख्याल में ये शख्स जो है, ये एक हेल्दी, साइकोलॉजिकली हेल्दी शख्स है. कार्ल रॉजर्स का हमने जिक्र इस रेफरेंस में भी किया था कि उसने क्लाइंट सेंटर्ड थेरेपी का इजरा किया था या इसको ईजाद किया था. क्लाइंट सेंटर्ड थेरेपी is based upon, if you remember we talked about it, based upon the assumption that everybody has this capacity to become a psychologically healthy person, and all that this therapist has to do is to guide the person, to guide the client towards his potential of becoming healthy. And he uses reflection. If you remember, he uses reflection as a methodology of taking the person towards a higher level of mental health. His method, as you know, as you remember now, is called client-centered therapy. I also told you that humanistic psychology was the beginning of what is now called positive psychology. Positive psychology focuses on such things as hope, happiness, optimism, positivity. All of these things are part of positive psychology. तो अगर आप ये समझें कि माहिरीन नफ्सियात या मालिजीन जो हैं ये सिर्फ न्यूरोसिस या साइकोसिस पर ही तवज्जो देते रहे हैं, तो अब ये दुरुस्त नहीं है, क्योंकि अब माहिरीन नफ्सियात जो हैं पिछली सदी से 20वीं सदी के तकरीबन मिडल से लेके अब तक, they are also beginning to take a look at the positive side of human psychology. This is what we talked about in the last lecture. Let us go forward from that and let us take a look at some of the methodologies of treatment that psychologists have developed in the last 200 years to about 150 years. पिछले 150-200 बरसों के दौरान जो माहिरीन नफ्सियात ने तरीका हाय कार ज़हनी अमराज के लिए इख्तियार किए हैं, उनका भी एक जायज़ा ले लेते हैं. लेकिन उनका जायज़ा लेने से पहले आपको एक बात ख्याल में लानी पड़ेगी, और वो ये जिसका हमने पहले भी 2-3 मरतबे आपसे जिक्र किया है, एंड दैट इज़ क्लासिफिकेशन ऑफ मेंटल डिजीज़ेज़. वो इसलिए ज़रूरी है that the methodology for the treatment of a particular disease depends upon the nature of that disease. And if the nature of that disease is clearly defined and demarcated, then it is easier for a therapist or a medical person or a doctor to select his mode of therapy. माफ कीजिएगा, ये इसको आप इस नुक्ता नज़र से देखें कि अगर हम मेडिकल पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू से एक मरीज़ का जायज़ा लें, तो फ़र्ज़ कीजिए उसको दर्द शिकम है, उसके पेट में दर्द है. Now, he could be treated by medicines or he could be treated by surgical methods. इसका इंतखाब कैसे होगा कि whether he should be treated by medicines or by surgery, that depends upon what is the nature of his tummy ache. If the tummy ache, if his pain in the stomach is due to a problem in the appendix, then medicines would not be preferred, then surgical procedures have to be adopted. If, on the other hand, it is due to certain medical problems, then surgical procedures may not be adopted. So, the diagnosis of the disease is critical in the choice of method of treatment of that disease. This is also true of mental diseases. Before we take a look at all the methodologies that psychologists and medical professional people have developed of treatment of mental disorders, we have to classify whether a disease is one type or another type. And only then, based upon this initial diagnosis, can we determine what methodology should be adopted. So before we take a look at the different methodologies, let us see how mental diseases are classified. We have already talked about it, and I will like you to jog your memory and remember that we talked about two sets of diagnostics. हमने आपसे दो ऐसी ज़राए का जिक्र किया था जिसके ज़रिए ज़हनी बीमारी की तशख़ीस हो सकती है, आजकल की जाती है. Do you remember what those methods we talked about were? One, if you remember, was developed on the North American continental scene, that is America and Canada, and that is known as DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is a book, which is like a dictionary, which contains a long list of all the mental diseases. The other, if you remember, was developed in Europe and the rest of the world under the guidance of World Health Organization, and that manual or that list of mental diseases is called what? ICD, International Classification of Diseases. DSM, developed by the American experts, and ICD, developed by the experts in the rest of the world. All the mental diseases are roughly classified into two major categories. One, that is a more severe form of mental disease that you can see on your screen and behind me also, called psychosis. And the other, a relatively less severe form of mental disease, as you can see on the screen, called neurosis. ये बड़ी रफ क्लासिफिकेशन आपको मैं बता रहा हूं. Depending upon the nature of the disease, whether the disease is psychosis or the disease is neurosis, a methodology of treatment of mental disorder is selected. The choice of what method is to be used for the treatment of a mental disease depends upon whether the disease is a psychosis or a neurosis. If it is a milder form, then we usually use one approach. If it is a more severe form, then we use another approach of treatment of mental disorder. One approach is called psychological approach to the treatment of mental disorder, which we use in relatively milder forms of mental disease or what we have called neurosis, and the other that we call the biological approach, which we use in a relatively more severe form of mental disease. The classification, therefore, of all the mental diseases have been done on the basis of psychosis or neurosis. In relation to the mental disease, the diagnostician or the therapist, तशखीस करने वाला शख्स या मालिज, वो तरीका अख्तियार करता है जो उसके ख्याल में उस बीमारी के लिए मुनासिब तरीका है. So the classification of mental diseases leads to the classification of treatment methodologies. कौन सी ट्रीटमेंट इस्तेमाल की जाएगी, ये इस बात पे इस चीज़ का इन्हिसार है कि एक शख्स की बीमारी की नौइयत क्या है. अगर तो बीमारी की नौइयत ज़्यादा सख्त है, ज़्यादा क्रॉनिक है, ज़्यादा सीवियर है, उस सूरत में बायोलॉजिकल अप्रोच इस्तेमाल की जाएगी. और अगर उस शख्स की बीमारी कम शदीद है और उसका ताल्लुक न्यूरोसिस से है, तो उस सूरत में साइकोलॉजिकल अप्रोच इस्तेमाल की जाती है. सो व्हाट आर वी टॉकिंग अबाउट? वी आर टॉकिंग अबाउट two approaches or two broad categories of treatment methodologies: psychological methodologies and biological methodologies. Let us take a look at these also. First, let me explain to you what are biological methodologies. It will be easier for you to understand. Biological methodologies of treatment are those which use medicines or biological methods for the treatment of mental disorder. अगर एक शख्स अद्वियात के जरिए एक जहनी बीमारी का इलाज कर रहा है, तो हम इसको कहेंगे कि ये बायोलॉजिकल अप्रोच टू ट्रीटमेंट ऑफ मेंटल डिसऑर्डर है. और साइकोलॉजिकल अप्रोच क्या है? Psychological approach in the treatment of mental disorder is one where the physician or the therapist does not use biological or medical means for the treatment of mental disorders, but uses psychological means of treatment of mental disorders. इसकी एक मिसाल से भी आपको आसानी हो जाएगी समझने में. अगर एक शख्स के सर में दर्द है, तो एक मालिज उसे एक दवाई के जरिए भी दुरुस्त कर सकता है, या मरीज से कहे कि तुम सैर करो या ठंडे पानी से नहा लो, so that your headache would improve. In the first instance, he is suggesting a biological He is adopting a biological approach. He is suggesting a biological methodology for the treatment of headache. In the second instance, he is suggesting a psychological methodology. He is adopting a psychological approach to the treatment of headache of his patient. हम माहिरीन नफ्सियात जो हैं, हम इसी तरह से ज़हनी बीमारियों का इलाज करते हैं. Those people who use psychological means for the treatment of mental diseases are called psychotherapists. The methodology used for treatment of mental disorders which uses psychological means is called psychotherapy, and the methodology that involves usage of biological means for the treatment of mental disorders is called psychiatry. Someone who uses biological means for the treatment of mental disorders is called a psychiatrist, and someone who does not use biological means but uses psychological means is called a psychotherapist. Do not confuse these two terms. I think I also talked about these two terms in one or two previous lectures. A psychiatrist is a medical doctor who adopts biological methodology for the treatment of mental disorder. A psychotherapist is a psychologist trained and certified and holding diplomas in treatment of mental disorder who uses psychological means for the treatment of mental disorders. So you have on the one hand psychotherapist treating milder forms, and on the other hand you have psychiatrists treating the more chronic forms of mental disease. ये दो चीज़ें याद रखिएगा. इन्हीं के बेसिस पे हमने जितने भी तरीका हायकार हैं नफ्सियाती इलाज के, उनको हमने तकसीम किया हुआ है. We have a series of psychological methodologies of treatment of mental disorders, and we have a series of biological methodologies of treatment of mental disorders. Let us take a view of what are first the psychological approaches or methodologies for the treatment of mental disorders. Psychological or non-biological approaches or methodologies can be divided into 5 main categories. I don't think we'll have much time to touch upon all of those 5, but we will cover the others in the next lecture. For the time being, we will try and cover as many as possible in the time allotted to this lecture. The 5 methodologies that are adopted for the treatment of mental disorders that fall within the category of psychological approaches are based upon the methodologies developed by the psychologists and psychotherapists that we have been talking about in the past 10 or 15 lectures. जो भी हमने जिन माहिरीन नफ्सियात का हमने जिक्र किया था, उनके सिस्टम पे बेस्ड जो तरीका हाय इलाज हैं, वही हम उनको उन तरीका इलाज को हमने 5 खानों में 5 कैटेगरीज में तकसीम किया है. पहला, the first method or approach to treatment of mental disorders which falls within the category of psychological approaches to the treatment of mental disorders is what is called psychodynamic approach. मैं फ़िलहाल सिर्फ नाम लूँगा और फिर इनकी डिटेल से डिस्क्रिप्शन दूँगा, इसलिए आप नामों से पहले फ़िलहाल फेमिलियर हो जाइए. जैसे कि आप स्क्रीन पे अपनी देख रहे हैं, is called the behavioral approach of treatment of mental disorder. तीसरा तरीका, जैसा अपनी आप स्क्रीन पे देख रहे हैं, is called the cognitive approach to treatment of mental disorders. और चौथा तरीका is called the humanistic approach to the treatment of mental disorders. और पांचवा तरीका, the group methodologies or group approach to the treatment of mental disorders. ये 5 मुख्तलिफ तरीके हैं. अब ये ना समझिए that the psychodynamic approach to treatment of mental disorder consists of one method. Not true. Psychodynamic approach to the treatment of mental disorders may consist of a number of approaches, a number of methodologies. Similarly, the behavioristic approach or behavioristic methodology may not consist of just one method of treatment of mental disorder, but it usually consists of a number of methodologies based upon behavioristic approaches. Similarly, when we think of cognitive methodology of treatment of mental disorder, then we are talking about a number of methodologies that fall within the category of cognitive approaches to the treatment of mental disorder. When we talk about the humanistic point of view, then we are not talking about just one or two. We are talking about a host of other methodologies that fall within the category of humanistic approach. And similarly, when we talk about group methodologies, then we are talking about a number of methodologies. तो हर कैटेगरी में, चाहे वो साइकोडायनामिक है या कॉग्निटिव है या बिहेवियरिस्टिक है या ह्यूमनिस्टिक है या ग्रुप है, कोई भी 5 आप अप्रोचेस ले लीजिए, इनमें बहुत से मेथड्स शामिल हैं. हम एक एक दो सिलेक्टिव मेथड्स का जिक्र करेंगे. चलिए सबसे पहले जिक्र करते हैं the first one, that is the psychodynamic methodologies. Notice that we are talking about psychodynamic approach or psychodynamic methodologies. मुराद ये है कि ये एक मेथड नहीं है, एक से ज्यादा है. इस मेथड को पढ़ने के लिए मेरे ख्याल में 2 चीज़ें आपके जहन में रहनी चाहिए. आप ये पढ़ आए हैं, आपको मालूम है, मैं सिर्फ आपको अयादा के तौर पे ये दिखाऊंगा कि आप ये देखा हैं, पढ़ा हैं, और इस अप्रोच को हम साइकोडायनामिक अप्रोच कहते हैं. साइकोडायनामिक अप्रोच एज्यूम्स, उसका ये मफरूज़ा है कि ज़हनी बीमारी जो है वो हमारे लाशऊर की पैदावार है. वो हमारे ज़हन में जो कुछ कॉन्फ्लिक्ट्स हैं, जो तसादुम मौजूद हैं, शऊर, लाशऊर और इसके मुख्तलिफ इजहार जो हैं, उनमें जो तसादुम हैं, जो हमारी मुहर्रकात लाशऊर में जिनकी हैसियत ऐसी है कि वो मुतसादिम रहें, उन मुहर्रकात की वजह से ज़हनी बीमारी तश्कील पाती है. साइकोडायनामिक approach assumes, is of the view that mental disease is a result of unconscious motivations, unresolved conflicts, forgotten, repressed memories of childhood, things that we are not aware of. तो हमारी unconscious impulses are responsible for mental diseases. That is the main assumption of psychodynamic methodologies. कोई आपके जहन में ख्याल आया कि कौन से माहिरीन नफ्सियात जो आप पढ़ आए हैं, जिनकी थियरीज के बारे में आपको मालूम है, वो कौन से माहिरीन नफ्सियात हैं? याद कीजिए. जाहिर है कि सबसे अहम नाम इस रेफरेंस में सिगमंड फ्रॉइड का होगा. और आप जानते हैं सिगमंड फ्रॉइड ने क्या तस्वुर पेश किया था? That mental disease is a result of unconscious motivation. That mental disease is a result of repressed wishes and desires. That mental disease is due to trauma. This was his point of view. आपको ये भी याद होगा कि युंग ने इस रेफरेंस में क्या कहा था. Jung had said that mental disease may be due to the collective unconscious. That part of the unconscious which contains the experiences of a whole generation, of a whole mankind. That mental disease is an expression of the collective unconscious. If you would recall, we talked about Adler also. And Adler had said that the feelings of inferiority, हमारा एहसास कमतरी जो है, that is responsible for a lot of problems in our daily life. So he is talking about inferiority complex as a dynamic force that creates mental disorder. You also remember we talked in this context of Karen Horney. And do you remember the needs that she had talked about, the neurotic needs that she had talked about? Need for perfection, for instance. The need for ambition, for instance. The need for power, for instance, that she had talked about. These thoughts could lead to neurosis in a person. So here are examples of Freud and Jung and Adler and Karen Horney showing to the person that his mental disease may be a result of unconscious motivations. Understanding mental disease and trying to alleviate mental disease, trying to cure mental disease by looking into the unconscious motivations, by looking into the influence, for instance, of the collective unconscious, or by looking into, for instance, the inferiority complex, is an approach which is called a psychodynamic approach to the treatment of mental disorder. Psychodynamic psychotherapists are those psychotherapists then who treat mental disorder by assuming that mental disorder is caused by unconscious motivations or neurotic needs or neurotic complexes, and then they try and resolve those. They may adopt different methodologies. As you remember, Freud had asked people to lie down on the couch, whereas Adler had talked to a person face to face across the table. But their main commonality is that they regard mental disease as a result of unconscious motivations. That is one of the methodologies or approaches called the psychodynamic approach. Another approach that may be adopted by psychotherapists, and the approach that may fall within the broad category of psychological approaches to treatment of mental disorder, is called behavioral approach or behavioristic approach. Do you remember who coined the term behaviorism? Yes, you are right. It was J.B. Watson, the American psychologist who put forward the view that psychologists should only look at the behavior of people and not be bothered about the unconscious motivations or the unresolved conflicts. Do you also remember in this regard what Pavlov had said and what Skinner had said? Let me refresh your memory. Pavlov worked with how animals and organisms learn. That was his main concern. And what did he see? That learning takes place as a result of conditioning. The behaviorist approach is based upon Pavlovian thinking, that as we learn different things in life by conditioning, people also learn to be mentally ill by being conditioned. That conditioning is the process on the basis of which a person has learned to become a mentally ill patient. When a psychotherapist adopts that approach, he is called a behaviorist psychotherapist. He is adopting a behavioral approach. There are many behaviorist psychotherapists. Let me just tell you about one. His name was Joseph Volpe, as you can see on your screen also, and his methodology is called systematic desensitization. Systematic desensitization was invented and used by Joseph Volpe to treat mental disorders, and his approach of systematic desensitization is based upon Pavlovian principle that human beings learn by conditioning. Volpe puts forward the view that people have learned to become mentally ill because of the process of conditioning. And what is systematic desensitization? फर्ज कीजिए एक शख्स को सांप से डर लगता है. वुल्पे का तरीका इलाज ये है कि वो यूजिंग Pavlovian methodology, he exposes the person to a snake and then positively reinforces the person. मसलन यूं समझिए एक बच्चा जो है 8 बरस का 9 बरस का वो सांप से डर रहा है. Volpe would expose him to a snake at a distance of 10 feet. And then when the child screams or does not scream, if the child screams, he will take the snake away at a distance of 12 feet. And then the child doesn't scream. The Volpe explains to him, look, the snake cannot hurt you. You are so further away from it. And then the child is reinforced. Gradually the snake is brought near and near over days near to the child. First it's brought to a distance of 10 feet, then 8 feet, then 6 and 4 and 3, until the child is no longer afraid of it and can even touch the snake. This is roughly an example of treatment of an abnormal fear of snakes based upon Pavlovian methodology of conditioning used by Volpe and others. And this technology, this technique for the treatment of mental disorder is called systematic desensitization. इसकी एक और मिसाल भी ये है कि मगरिब के ममालिक में वो लोग जो शराब नहीं छोड़ सकते, उनको सिस्टमैटिक डिसेंसिटाइजेशन के जरिए शराब छुड़वाई जाती है। वो लोग जो बुलंदी पे जाने से डरते हैं, उनके लिए भी सिस्टमैटिक डिसेंसिटाइजेशन का तरीका इस्तेमाल किया जाता है। वो लोग जो जहाज में चढ़ने से डरते हैं, who are mortally afraid, who have a fear of flying, उनको भी इसी तरीके से इलाज उनका किया जाता है। As you have noticed, this methodology is based upon Pavlovian or behavioristic point of view. That is, we learn by conditioning, and as we learn by conditioning, if we remove reinforcement, the conditioning bond will become extinct, and extinction of a neurotic response is treatment. This is the second methodology, or a group of methodologies called behavioral approach to the treatment of mental disorder. एक और अप्रोच का भी जिक्र कर लेते हैं, called the cognitive approach to the treatment of mental disorder. Cognitive approach to the treatment of mental disorder assumes that mental disease is due to faulty thinking on the part of a mentally unhealthy or a mentally upset or a mentally sick person. That faulty, cloudy, unclear thinking results in creation of mental diseases. Those psychotherapists who adopt the cognitive approach are psychotherapists who believe, who hold the view that the patient is sick because his thinking is faulty. One of the prominent psychologists within this category of cognitive psychotherapist is Albert Ellis. We talked about his system of personality in reference to REBT, Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy. REBT stands for Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy, which means that people have become neurotics or are suffering from mental diseases because they have a faulty way of thinking. Albert Ellis points out a number of faults that may lie within a person's thinking cognitive structure. For instance, if a person thinks that he has a dire need to be loved, then that dire need to be loved can result in a lot of frustration, can be a source of a number of symptoms. Another one that he points out, or cognitive therapists point out, is what Karen Horney had called the need for perfection. Remember Karen Horney, when she made a list of neurotic needs, one of the needs that she talked about was the need for perfection. The cognitive behavior therapists, particularly Albert Ellis and people who belong in the same category, consider the need for perfection to be a source of mental ill health, to be a source of mental disease. अजीब सी बात है. How can the need for perfection lead to mental disease? Because cognitive therapists point out, a person can never be perfect. So if he has this high need for perfection, he will always be unhappy. And unhappiness is a source of a number of mental diseases. And that is their point of view. That need, a dire need, a high need for affection and love, a need for perfection, is a source of a lot of unhappiness, frustration, and mental diseases. Now, those people who believe and who adopt the point of view that faulty thinking is the source of mental disease, they are considered to belong in the category of cognitive therapists. Cognitive therapists treat mental disease by treating those patterns of thinking which are faulty. Faulty patterns of thinking, irrational thinking, illogical thinking, in the point of view of these people, the cognitive therapists, is the cause of mental disease, and correcting these faulty patterns of thinking can help the patient to become healthy, to recover from his disease. That is the point of view of cognitive therapists. We talked about 3 different approaches to the treatment of mental disorders. मैंने ये बताया आपको कि the selection of a procedure for the treatment of mental disease depends upon the nature of mental disease. That if the nature of mental disease is severe, then we will use one category of methodologies. If the nature of mental disease is less severe, then we will use another methodology of treatment of mental disorders. The more severe form uses biological methodologies, and the less severe forms uses psychological methodologies. We started talking about psychological methodologies. We talked of 5 different categories of psychological methodologies. Of those 5, we have talked about 3 of them. What were those 5? Do you remember? Number 1, cognitive. Number 2, psychodynamic. Number 3, behavioristic. Number 4, humanistic. And number 5, group approach to the treatment of mental disorder. Those mental disorders which are less severe, which have been classified as neurosis, as opposed to those ones which are more severe, that have been classified as psychosis. Psychosis uses more of energy and therefore is more chronic. That is why it requires certain other methodologies, biological methodologies. Neurosis is less chronic, therefore it reacts to psychological methodologies. We talked about 3 methodologies of those 5 that I have identified. We talked about 3 methodologies. The first in that context was psychodynamic approach, where the psychotherapist assumes that mental disease is due to unconscious motivations or unresolved conflicts. For instance, I gave you the example of Freud, and then I gave you the example of Adler, and I gave you the example of Jung and Karen Horney. These people regard certain unconscious motivations as the source of mental disease. And then we talked about the behavioral or the behavioristic approach, who assume that people learn by conditioning to become mentally sick, and we can remove their mental sickness by adopting certain methodologies that are used in conditioning. And then we talked about the cognitive approach to mental illness where the psychotherapist assumes that faulty thinking is an expression of a mental disease in a person, and that correcting the faulty thinking can correct a person's mental disease and can make him healthy. We will touch upon and explain other methodologies next time. Until that time, do look these things up. Do look after yourselves. Khuda Hafiz. God be with you.